thank you all for being here tonight. I am going to share my screen. I have some images, um, and I'm also going to make sure that I keep I just need to enable the chat function, and I'll keep that in a kind of corner of my screen. Feel free anytime to kind of jump in and ask questions or have me go back to something or whatever else. So I'm first just gonna sort of show you a close-up of the cover image that's on my book. So this is John Thorley's Melissa Logia, and he was a reverend. It was really common to have pastors as beekeepers. They were the ones who, like university scholars, were writing the books about bees. There are hundreds of books in the 17th century that are either bee husbandry guides or larger agricultural manuals that included beekeeping in them. And so John Thorley, um, an 18th century pastor, he had this particular text was a subscription text. So um, a lot of university professors, a lot of fellow pastors, and a lot of women as subscribers. So it's really interesting to see the way the Central Coast Beekeepers Alliance is kind of engaged in this really important mentorship of, asking questions of like, what am I supposed to do at this moment in this part of the season, and things of that nature, because the ways that beekeeping knowledge was conveyed was either through these kind of books and subscription services, or through from family to family and close mentorship. So a lot of the women subscribers, for instance, were called good wives or sometimes country housewives. And so they would be, it would be expected that they would keep not only the house and the children, but also the kitchen garden and the herb garden, for both foods and remedies. And so they would pass this knowledge down from mother to daughter. This would be expected knowledge of good wives of the period, particularly in colonial America. So we're going to go through a couple of issues today, and this is not getting into all of the nitty gritty of the literature of the book. If anybody's interested, by all means, ask me, and I'm happy to talk about literature. I figured that since this is Central Coast Beekeepers Alliance, that it would be fun to just sort of talk about beekeeping technology and really the essential innovations in beekeeping that were precursors to Langstroth, and how they got there, and why they got there. So we'll be talking about the sovereign structure of the honeybee hive as they discussed it during this period. We'll be talking about the fact that colonization itself, the English metaphor for colonizing America in the New World, was in fact the bee swarm. We'll also be talking about just different beekeeping methods and how they really in the 17th century fomented this idea of saving bees rather than killing them through the various methods that they were usually killed. And then we'll just quickly touch on ideas of pollination, since in the 17th century they did not fully understand the mechanism of pollination. So the first thing that I'll start with is just the idea. Now, of course, we look at like Thomas Seeley's Honeybee Democracy, and we see bees as the society that reached consensus and are communicating in various ways. But the idea that bees were the ideal form of government, for thousands of years, different types of literature talked about bees as the ideal form of government. And they specifically talked about this as a monarchy, right? That you'd have one sovereign who they believed was male, who would rule over all. And so you can see this John Day's Parliament of Bees image, right? Here we have our what they now, by the time we get to 1741, they know this is the queen bee. They would see the bees that attended the queen bee as important advisors and princes, they would call them, despite the fact that they obviously weren't princes. They didn't necessarily understand what bees ate, what roles they aged into. So there's also this, the most important beekeeper of the entire period is Charles Butler, who wrote The Feminine Monarchy, or a treatise concerning bees, in 1609. And there are two really important things about this. He goes through in, a kind of unprecedented scientific way, all the nitty-gritty of what you're supposed to do each month in preparing bees, and how to attend to them in the best, most effective way. But then the other thing too is that he finally, despite the fact that he has not yet looked at them under microscopes, that would be Jan Swammerdam later in the century, but he says, the males here bear no sway at all, this being an Amazonian or feminine kingdom. So he popularizes the idea that it is a queen who is in charge, and that the worker bees are female. He speculates whether or not the drones are male, but he's not fully convinced about that. He says that also that the bees abhor polyarchy, which is closest to our idea of democracy, right? The idea that multiple people would have input in the government. So he says that basically democracy is anarchy, God having showed in them unto men an express pattern of a perfect monarchy, the most natural and absolute form of government. So he really sees this as, that this is all about knowing your place. If you're the sovereign, you're in charge, and everybody else needs to kind of know their place within society. And this is a hugely popular idea throughout the 17th century. So then when we switch into English colonization of America, through this idea called the Translatio Imperii, which is basically, the translation of empire, or the transfer of the rule of the English to America, you have a lot. I mean, I've included two examples here, but a ton of information about how what the English was doing was basically swarming like bees swarm, and that the sovereign, right, that King James was still going to be sovereign of America. So Reverend John Cotton was the pastor of the First Church of Boston, and he says it this way: to plan a colony, that is, a company that agree together to remove out of their own country and settle a city or commonwealth elsewhere, nature teaches bees to do so. When the hive is too full, they seek abroad for new dwellings. So when the hive of the commonwealth is so full that tradesmen cannot live one by another, but eat up one another, in this case, it is lawful to remove. So essentially, he's saying that two important aspects of this. One is that the English are going to swarm to America, and that's going to be a justified use of space, right? That it's fine for them to kind of implant themselves in this new space. The other thing too is part of why they're doing this. We always hear about like the Puritans and the Pilgrims and everything else, and that this is all about religious freedom. But here you have a Congregationalist pastor who's basically saying this is economic too. The idea that tradesmen can't, that there's not enough land and there's not enough business in England, so we're gonna, kind of conquer this new land. Now, there's a whole part of the book that's all about how various Native American nations specifically reacted to this. And if anybody has questions, I'm happy to address that, because the English did not see the sovereignty of these various native nations that they were encountering. Instead, they saw this as empty land that was up for grabs. And so the other thing too is the Cambridge Platform was actually the governing document for establishing churches in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they use the same exact rhetoric, which is, as bees, when the hive is too full, issue forth by swarms and are gathered into other hives, so the churches of Christ may do the same upon like necessity, and therein hold forth to them the right hand of fellowship, both in gathering into a church and in the ordination of their officers. So in other words, we're doing God's work by swarming to America and populating America. The thing that is so interesting, of course, all of you already know that honeybees are not native to North America, that Apis mellifera is not native to North America. And you likely know that they were brought to the US on English ships. There were 4 English ships that set off in December 1621 and arrived in 1622 that had beehives. And they did not understand why it was so important, but it almost became a superstition, because as soon as they brought beehives over, all of their plants started growing, and they did not understand that it was pollination. They simply thought, well, wherever we have beehives, our plants thrive and we survive the winter. And so we're just going to bring beehives everywhere. They had no idea why exactly that was. And so that's, a sort of surprising aspect of things. So then once we shift into talking a little bit about the kind of technology of beekeeping, you have all, of course, seen straw skeps, which were definitely still the prominent method of beekeeping throughout the 17th century in both England and in America. But by the time we get to the end of the century, we have some hives that look really similar to our modern hives. So we'll just kind of talk a little bit about the transition there. So for instance, of the straw skep, of course, we know that bees ended up dying in the process of harvesting honey and wax from straw skeps. John Worledge, who wrote both Apiarium and The Complete Bee Master in the 17th century, sort of talks about the typical way of keeping bees. And he says, "It is best to take them by the usual way of smothering by the fume of brimstone, admitted by some hole in the bottom of the bee house, for let not anyone imagine that their honey can be taken from them and the bees preserved." So, of course, fume of brimstone or sulfur was the most common way of killing the bees. But if people didn't have access to sulfur, they also recommended kind of burying them in a pit or drowning them, which oftentimes would mess with the honey and the wax. And people had a problem with that kind of level of adulteration. So there were different methods that they would recommend. Some talked about driving them by force and violence. So there were all sorts of different ways of killing the bees to take the harvest of honey and wax. But there was, there was a very keen interest in the period of like, how do we manage to try and save the bees? And so I have a couple images here. The biggest proponent for saving the bees was in fact a king, Charles II. He was the son of Charles I, who was the king who was beheaded in 1649. So when and Charles II has a crazy story about his escape from England and retreating to France for a while. And so when he comes back and starts to rule in 1660, after the Civil War, after the protectorate regime of Oliver Cromwell, he becomes really, really interested in how do we save bees. Mostly because he sees this as the ultimate symbol of monarchy and of power. And so if you kill bees, then aren't you killing that ultimate symbol of monarchy and power, just like they killed his father, who also identified very strongly with bees, by the way. So he actually goes to visit John Evelyn, who was a really important aristocrat who had built this hive design. Um, and he gets this from, if you've ever been to England and seen any of the architecture of Sir Christopher Wren, while he was a student at Oxford, built a box hive. And he didn't do it very well, but his innovation was to put some glass panels into the box hive so that you could actually do a little bit of observation. And so his hives were then perfected by an Oxford professor, Dr. John Wilkins. And so then John Evelyn had replicas made of Wilkins's hives, all of which were made to look like palaces and castles. And so Charles II goes to John Evelyn's palace at Deptford, Say Court Palace at Deptford, and he wants to see these beautiful, magisterial sort of beehives, and he utterly loves them, and he decides that he wants to do everything he can to save bees, even collaborating with a Scotsman. So John Getty has this very, very long title: A New Discovery of an Excellent Method of Bee Houses and Colonies, which frees the owners from the great charge and trouble that attends the swarming of bees and delivers the bees from the evil reward of ruin for the benefit they brought their masters. So John Getty basically is awarded a monopoly by Charles II for a proprietary type of bee box, which is essentially an octagon, which has a frame within it. And then you would have four boards that you would put across, which is what they would build their wax onto. So it's probably closest to a Warre design, right, where you might just have the stick and they build it out. It wouldn't be like a pre-made frame the way we have pre-made frames. You would have the hive entrance here. You would also have, these would be hinges right here, and this would be a glass panel so that you could see into the hive. This would be a sliding box or a sliding door. And so basically what he says is, the way of removing the boxes, he comes up with this idea of saving the bees. The way of removing the boxes when full of honey is this: open the little door on the side. So you'd open this door of the box which is uppermost with the shutter at once to cut the work. So you just, cut out what you wanted. Of course, you'd get some stings in the process, but you'd probably be using, he talks about using smoke as well. And close the square hole of the lower box. So you're shutting off the bees from the lower box, thereby securing the bees in their work in the lower boxes, so that by this dexterous and commodious way of removing honey, the destruction of the bees by stifling, drowning, violent driving, or other ways, the usual but unkind requital of their industry is prevented, and sufficient store is reserved for the bees according to the season, judgment being made thereof by inspection through the glass windows. So in other words, he's saying, get your bees to overproduce, and then you can take the top box, shut this hole, and pull out some of the comb and harvest it that way, but leave enough for the bees for the rest of the season. So obviously this is, kind of closer to what we do now. The interesting thing is that we then meet the governor of North Carolina, who does not start off as the governor of North Carolina. He starts off as an Irish member of parliament, and he talks about how miserable he is in Ireland. And so he spends a lot of time out in his bee yard, very closely observing his bees. And this is all part of this sort of, the height of the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution is, in fact, one of the founders, Sir Francis Bacon, in the 17th century, said that bees were the ultimate scientist. And if humans could just replicate what bees do in discerning which flowers to select, then we would, have huge advancements in human society. So Arthur Dobbs is very much, kind of caught up in the scientific revolution, and he makes two really important discoveries, which he publishes with the Royal Society in London. So the first is, he says, now I think that turning up the full hive and setting an empty hive upon it and driving the bees into it is preferable to smoking. Here he's talking about the French beekeeper René Réaumur, who would just smoke the bees in order to take their honey. But he's saying that actually, if you put an empty bee box and you drive the bees into it, for then a very few bees will remain in the full hive, and those few may be stupefied, and the bees in the empty hive being put on the table, the combs may be taken out and selected at leisure without hazard, and afterwards the empty hive may be turned up and their old hive set over them, so that they will go up without scruple into their former hive and repair their work. So he makes this, sort of, the thing with Getty is that because it was proprietary knowledge, most people couldn't afford these super fancy, nice hives, right? And so he was like, well, how can you do this if you just have a regular bee box? And so Arthur Dobbs made it really popular to, kind of widely distributed this knowledge of how to actually harvest these products without killing them. Which is an important advance. And in fact, the king is so thrilled with this. At this point, the king is George II, that he makes him governor of North Carolina shortly after this letter. The other thing that's really important about what he discovers is he realizes he brings to the English-speaking world the knowledge of pollination. So he says, Providence has appointed the bee to be very instrumental in promoting the increase of vegetables, since the worker bees take, quote, the male seed of the plant, entering the pistillum or matrix in the flower in order to impregnate the ovum and make it prolific. And so all of a sudden, this idea of swarming to America comes full circle, because you have the governor of North Carolina who's basically saying that this is a really, that this was a great idea all along. If you want to colonize, America, you have to colonize with bees first, because they're essential to agriculture, which is something that they just did not, which was not knowledge that they had prior to that. So those are sort of the main things that I wanted to make sure that I covered. I'm happy to open it up to any questions that anybody has or comments.
I have a question.
Sure.
How does this intersect with the idea of bees and beekeeping coming from Spain and their colonization?
So there were some Spanish, we don't know the exact date of when Spain brought beehives to the continental US. So there are conflicting accounts. The one account that people talk about as later, as potentially being as early as the 16th century, is very highly questioned among scholars, because it's one line in an encyclopedia that doesn't have a source. And so the earliest date that we know that Spain brought them for sure, because we have an actual diary entry, I believe is it 1650? I might be getting that wrong, but it is after the English had brought them. Of course, earlier, when you have Cortez coming to Mexico, he says at least 6 different varieties of stingless bees, because Cortez actually back in Spain kept an apiary. And so and he says that the best honey is the Estebenton honey, which is available in November. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of important ways in which the Spanish really value Mesoamerican honey, um, and try to see if they could bring some bees back to Spain. But they were successfully able to bring the honey back, but not the bees. But yes, there's both the English and the Spanish were interested in beekeeping, bringing beekeeping to North America and Central America. The English just do it successfully a little bit earlier than the Spanish do. Jonathan, I see you have a hand up. Oh,
I
and
have
then
a question.
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, how do we acquire the book, and what sparked your interest in this area in beekeeping?
So the book is available on Amazon. I will say right now it's ridiculously priced because they price it when it first comes out. Academic books are priced for library sales, so it's like $150, which is absurd. I can talk to the publisher about whether or not we can do some sort of like Central Coast Beekeepers Alliance discount or something. So I'll reach out, and if that's possible, then we can do that. I would put it on the Facebook page. But the other thing is, someone who published another book a year ago, their book went on sale for like $30 on Black Friday. So my guess is that the day after Thanksgiving, this book will probably be way, way, way down in price. And to answer the second part of the question of how I got interested, it's because I'm a Latin nerd. So John Milton wrote a treatise where he called King Charles I, the one who got beheaded, the Egyptian Apis. And all of these famous scholars, everybody missed this. They thought he was talking about an obscure god, but he was also talking about the process of consuming something, regurgitating it, and then reconsuming it. And I was like, wait a second, that's apis as in Latin for bee. I was like, John Milton, was really fluent in Latin. And so I started looking at Milton and what he was doing with bees, especially in Paradise Lost, and it just grew from there. So, that was, I don't know, back in 2009 when I first discovered that passage. And so I've been studying it ever since. And
I have a question about,
yeah, go
may I
ahead.
ask a question about how the burgeoning ideas of democracy, both in North America and in France, were reconciled with the previous notions about the perfect monarchy, and what happened as people began to say, we as people should have equal chances to have a say in our governance?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's absolutely really essential. The funny thing is, this is in the conclusion of the book, but the founding fathers have tons of discussion about bees, mostly because of Bernard Mandeville's The Fable of the Bees, which talks about, which is basically like this economic theory that industry and progress are driven by selfishness. And George Washington thought this was the worst thing in the world. And yet, George Washington also kept bees. And so did Jefferson at Monticello, right? So everyone relied on bees because they needed them for the pollination, and they enjoyed the craft of beekeeping too. They were really kind of proud of the beekeepers that they had on staff. That being said, they were no longer, they had become disillusioned by the idea of bees as the perfect form of government. In France, it's a little bit different because you have a lot of the French monarchy had taken up the bees as a symbol, but then Napoleon takes up the bee as a symbol. But then even later in France, like there's a socialist watchmaking factory or watchmaking group that takes up the bee as their symbol, and they use it to reclaim their you know, the idea of a society that's working together productively, not a society that's based on hierarchy. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, it does. I'm just, because obviously for the Christian, spreading religion, let's go west and start a new church. That kind of attribute to beekeeping and that kind of thought about what we're doing is part of God's way of organizing the universe versus the actual principles of how do we organize ourselves as a government. Those issues. It's interesting to think that they would keep it for some aspects, but reject it for others.
Yeah, and the interesting thing too is that rejection had started in the 17th century, or actually in the late 16th century, because the Catholics had long, from the 4th century on, had seen the bee society as perfect government, with the Pope as the sovereign bee or the queen bee, right? And then as Protestantism comes in, they have something called the Beehive of the Romish Church, which was by this sort of radical Protestant who was basically like, yeah, we've got to get rid of this bee image because it's the worst. And so John Milton takes up that perspective too. He has a really critical view of bees and beekeeping. So. And Jonathan, I see that you have a hand up.
That was Jonathan who was asking those questions.
Oh, it was Jonathan asking those questions. Oh, okay. My chat is a little bit, okay. And then Maureen, I see your question in the chat. How does one bring hives in a ship on a trip that takes several months? That is why they took off in December. They basically stuffed the hives and they were like, because December crossings were not really great in the 17th century. So they were like, well, we'll just risk it. And so they just brought them as cargo. So, and they managed to survive, luckily. And then the second question, if the English are killing the bees when harvesting honey and wax, how did the four original hives reproduce? Which hives? They're basically just catching swarms. And so, they would catch a swarm, have it for the season, and then kill it. And then they'd have to either purchase a swarm from somebody else or go, hunting for a new.
The four that were originally brought over on the ship, I think.
Oh, okay. How did they reproduce? So that is, yeah, that's still when they're killing them. So I assume that they did not kill, there's nothing in the historical record, but I would say that they did not kill those particular hives to harvest. Each one of the colonists, the advice was to bring 50 gallons worth of honey to the New World with you, and to bring a store of wax with you as well. So my guess is that they allowed them to reproduce. And then they didn't kill those first ones until they started they actually started swarming into the forests too, and that's when they like really reproduced quickly. And then I see Jennifer has a hand up too.
Yeah, hi. So I am I have several hundred hives and I'm an educator. And I'm always curious about the story that's not told with women beekeepers. And I noticed you touched on it a little bit.
Yeah.
And part of my theory, and it sounds like maybe this is, what you were talking about, is like, because the hive was an extension of the pantry, it wasn't really something that women were writing about. And it was mostly men who were, clergymen and with the church and people who wrote about things anyway, who were writing about bees. So where did you find the information about women? And is there more that you could share about that?
Sure. So there, some of you might be familiar. There's a little bit of information. Tammy Horn has a book about bees in America. And so she has a little bit of information, particularly about Dutch women beekeepers. But there's also just, for instance, Thorley's manuscript. I actually have a copy of it. It's it's elsewhere in the house, but I have a copy of it, and it just talks it and it has the list of subscribers, and a lot of them are Miss and Mrs. and Madam. There's also a lot of the male sources actually have sections that are devoted to women beekeepers, because they say, like, this is what the women do. And what they mean by this is what the women do is this is what most beekeepers do. So there's a real divide between, like, the practical everyday beekeeper, the people who are doing most of the beekeeping, and these few elite pastors and and university professors. And so they're the ones who are, the pastors are the ones who are writing the books. But the vast majority of beekeeping is, in fact, done by women, and all of those academic men acknowledge that, and they tend to have a little section about this is what the good wives do. Like, this is the positive knowledge that they convey, and these are the things that they do that maybe we don't agree with. But absolutely, it was a skill that if you were a woman living in rural America, you were keeping bees.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh yeah, I can absolutely either send a link. I see Archie's, can we download your slides? Absolutely, I can put a link up to the Facebook page, hopefully, if I can figure out how to do that. And if not, I have I pressed record on this so that I could do the, so that if anybody missed it and wanted to, like, go back to look at anything, I will probably try to post this on YouTube, and then I can post the link. If I can't get it directly onto Facebook, then I'll just put it up on YouTube and post the link to the Central Coast Beekeepers Facebook page so that anybody can see it who wants to. And my email address is also on there too. If anybody wants to email me and ask questions, or you want to hear more about bees in literature, or bees, Native American ideas about bees are really, really amazingly fascinating. And there are lots and lots of different perspectives. So I'm happy to, if anybody wants to reach out via email too, that's totally fine. So any other questions or parting thoughts or ideas? Sue, I see you have a hand up.
Here's one.
Let's see. Okay. Okay, so I can't tell if there were any other questions that I missed.
Yeah, there was one. It looks like it was from Archie.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
What are you doing now, and how has COVID impacted you?
Oh, okay. So I am, I teach, so since I teach at Cal Poly, I'm teaching virtually. So I sit in this chair a lot. I spend a lot of time on Zoom and spend a lot of time kind of helping my students through. One of the courses I teach this quarter is called Ecofeminism, which is just basically about environmental justice. So I do talk to my students about sustainability in the environment and how that works with issues of social justice. So that's closely aligned with the things that I do in my book. And so COVID is keeping me stationary. You know, I've spent a ton of time going to England and to the East Coast. I researched at Harvard and McGill in Montreal and all of these places for the book, but I'm now, you know, I'm now settled here. But it's been, you know, a pretty amazing experience because my students have been really game for this conversion to virtual learning. So. And so thank you all for coming. This was really fun to talk about bees. I hope this was not dull. I never know with the 17th century how much people are going to be interested in or not. But
no, this is great, Nicole. I truly enjoyed this, and I'm impressed that we had people from all over the country stop by to hear your perspective on beekeeping and how it formed the idea of America. This is great. Really deep history. I love it.
yeah, so I see Patricia wrote, can you please talk more about resources in females in literature? So one of the chapters in the book is by Hester Poulter, who was this woman who was like totally, you know, she was writing into her 70s. She died at 78 years old, which in the 16th century was unheard of. In fact, she survived, she outlasted 13 of her 16 children, which is pretty crazy as well. She spends a lot of time in her garden writing about her bees. There are a lot, Margaret Cavendish, who is a really famous weird aristocrat, ends up talking a little bit about bees as well. So there are a lot of women who are talking about bees. They're just not necessarily, they're using them more as symbols than beekeeping. But yeah, the women who are good wives are definitely keeping their bees and keeping their houses and keeping their children, but they're not having time to write. So yeah, so and Heidi, if anybody wants, I could do a whole talk on Native American perspectives, because some of the native, like the Eastern, a lot of the Eastern societies had these kind of ambivalent ideas about honeybees, and yet a lot of Western societies were very, very interested in adopting beekeeping kind of mythology and ideas into their own sort of life ways. In fact, the Hopi are the ones who really embrace the European honeybee as heaven sent, and see them as sacred. And so, okay, so several other people talking about the Native American stuff. And then the, you know, whereas the Wampanoags are in Massachusetts and are very much, you know, see the bees as potentially negative. They talked about this as the white man's fly, right? So the idea that a honeybee meant, it was like a sentinel that meant that the white man was coming if they saw a honeybee in the forest. And so in the Wyandottes, in fact, said that there was a prophecy that there would be a strange looking insect, and then the white man would come and wipe out Native Americans. And so there's a whole prophecy about that. And so when a Wyandotte elder sees a honeybee and realizes it's different than the native bees, he's like, you know, we're about to be wiped out. So there are all sorts of really fascinating ideas. And I'm happy to do a second talk if anyone is interested.
We'll take you up on that.
Well, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate all of the great questions, and feel free to follow up via email, and I will figure out how to get this posted on the Facebook page in some capacity or other. All right, so I think no more questions. Excellent. Okay, well, I will hopefully see all of you in meetings in the future. That would be really, really great. And good luck with your bees with this lack of rain and this heat.
Very good.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.